Hello, my name is Bita Purvash, Assistant Curator at the Aga Khan Museum. Welcome to our Curator conversation on two beautiful 17th century tiles from our collection and how our colleagues from Royal Ontario Museum delved into the history of these tiles and helped us solve this puzzle. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the scholars who performed this amazing research, and both are my dear professors. Dr. Lisa Golombek, Curator Emeritus at the Royal Ontario Museum, who also is a professor at the University of Toronto and a scholar on Islamic art with the focus on the art of Iran. And Dr. Robert Mason, who is an archaeologist scientist at the Royal Ontario Museum, also a professor at the University of Toronto, and an expert in the scientific analysis of ceramics. Thank you very much for joining us today. So, Dr. Golombek, I want to ask you, please let us know how this project got started.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us. We're always happy to talk about this project. It was actually these two tiles that started me, or let's say restarted me on the project. A couple of years ago, the Aga Khan Museum asked me if I would write something up for their website about several objects, and these tiles were among them. So I was happy to do that, and I started looking at them, and I noticed that one of them was missing a corner. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Had a look at it, and I saw that, in fact, that was part of the tile, that it was supposed to be missing that corner. And then I realized this must be part of one of the great tile arches that some years ago I started studying, but I let it lapse because I got onto other things. Our museum had actually bought two rather complete and one partially complete example of these great tile arches. Two of ours are mounted in the Islamic Gallery in the Royal Ontario Museum. At any rate, I thought, well, I wonder what large panel these two tiles came from. There must be, almost 60 others that belong to it. And so I started looking, and then I realized this would be an interesting project. Let's just gather up all the information we can find about these tile arches. I knew that there were some in Stuttgart and Berlin and Hamburg and other places. And then I realized this was going to be too much for me to handle. So I went to my colleague of my two past projects, Dr. Mason, is to see if he would contribute his talents and skills and his great eye to working on this project. And so we got started again a couple of years ago, gathering all this material and looking on the web, which now was a new resource that we could use to find what I call orphan tiles. So that's how we got started. And thanks to the Aga Khan Museum, or this would have lain dormant.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. And Dr. Mason, what was your experience when you started working on these tiles?
Well, my first reaction when Lisa turned up in my office that day was that I was hoping she wasn't going to ask me to do another study on blue and white pottery. But the tiles are far more interesting. They are unique objects, not quite unique, because usually there's two of them, rather than mass-produced things. They are really works of art themselves. And it's the narratives within them that particularly interests me, that there are stories involved in almost every tile. And some of the stories we haven't worked out what they are yet, but there's a story behind every one.
This is very inspiring. So now would you please walk us through the steps that was taken in researching these tiles?
These two tiles in the collection of the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto were probably made in Isfahan, Iran, in about 1685. They depict a clump of irises. The bottom right corner of the bottom tile is missing. It shows the same marks of grinding as the sides, as a part of the preparation of the tile to go into its frieze. The treatment is bold, suitable to architectural decoration, not designed to stand alone on a museum wall. Originally, it would have been part of an entire frieze of tiles over an archway, like this one in the Royal Ontario Museum. One thing you can see right away is that one side mirrors precisely the other. This and other friezes were acquired by then ROM Curator of Islamic Art Lisa Golombek in 1976. Over the years she has done some research on these tiles, but it's not until recently, when she was asked by the Aga Khan Museum to look into their iris tiles, that she approached colleague and co-author Robert Mason, an archaeologist and scientist accustomed to piecing together the past, to work together on the tile project. The team has attempted to recreate all of this group of tile friezes by looking at museum collections and sales catalogues from around the world, sometimes working with existing friezes, other times by piecing together separate fragments. These are in the ROM and are placed on a framework based on the complete tile friezes. We had no idea at first that these monkeys on the left were related to the men on the right. However, since we know one side is the mirror of the other, we can flip tiles over from one side to fit them on the other. The man in yellow on the right is actually from the opposite side of the frieze from the tile beneath it. We also know that there are always two versions of the frieze, in this case one with a green background and one with a blue background, but with almost precisely the same design. As we slowly piece the image together, the monkeys and men connect, creating a narrative that will require further investigation. This work continues, for here in this recent sales catalogue you can see that this tile is a counterpart of this tile, but from the opposite side of the frieze and from the other version of the frieze. So far we have found a little less than 30 separate tile frieze designs of the same distinct style, and of each of these only 2 examples of each design are known, suggesting a building of about 60 archways, of which the overwhelming majority are exactly the same size. An example of how they were used can be found in the Hearst Palace in Isfahan, built in 1669. The tiles are made in a similar way, but a distinctly different style from the tiles we're looking at. We think the building is now lost, but was in Iran, at Isfahan. And near the Maidan, the great public space of Isfahan. This contemporary drawing on the right and this reconstruction on the left shows the area of the Maidan as it looked in the late 17th century. And this building, the Palace of the Stables, would be about the right size and type, with long arcades around the perimeter. It was demolished shortly before these tiles first appeared on the art market. Apart from trying to understand how these tiles were used, we are investigating how they were made, including handheld X-ray fluorescence analysis to determine chemistry. This image is taken with a digital microscope to show the structure of one of these tiles. The sequence of production begins with a plain, square, earthenware tile about 22 centimeters across. This is then covered with a white glaze. The design is outlined with a black paint which probably contained wax. This is the so-called cuerda seca technique, which can be translated from the Spanish as dry cord, presumably because it appears dry in comparison to the wet glazed parts. Then other colored glazes are painted over the white glaze and are kept separate by the waxy line until they dry, and the tile is then fired. Another way of looking at this is to recreate the sequence with a simplified version of this bearded man. We start with a plain white glazed tile. The basic design is put on the tile using a pattern that enables the design to be copied to both sides of the same frieze and both copies of the same design. The areas between the black lines were then filled with colour. It is at this stage that the tile would have received its main firing. Afterwards, a talented artist, perhaps the original designer themselves, would have added finer details using the same black dry pigment. This would then have been fired again, probably at a lower temperature, to fuse this last black paint to the tile. The Aga Khan Museum tiles would have been made in this manner. To start to understand where these tiles literally fit, they have been placed on the framework based on the complete tile phrases. The angle of the cut at the bottom indicates that it is from this position on the frieze. We then set about looking for related tiles. This was our first connection. From an old sales catalogue, we found this. The red line around it shows that these are flipped over from the other side of the frieze to fit our framework. Then we found a more recent sales catalogue with this piece from the same side. Since this is clearly a frieze of peacocks, we tried this one, and it also fits. Then Lisa Golombek found the original sales catalogue from a Kevorkian sale at New York in 1927, and you can see it is our complete peacock and iris frieze, both sides. So we now have a good idea of the entire frieze. We think this is the actual frieze published by Kevorkian in 1927, and how it was broken up and separated, we don't know. With the gracious help of museum staff, dealers, and other colleagues around the world, the team will continue hunting for lost tiles and piecing together the lost narratives they represent.
This is truly fascinating, and seeing these tiles in context really helps us to see the entire imagery of the tiles and to better understand how the people of the time really perceive these tiles. But one question remains here. What's the next step, or what is the next puzzle to solve here, how we can move forward? And I would like to ask Dr. Mason to let us know.
Well, from my perspective, there are two things. One is to continue with the technical analysis. I'd like to do scanning electron microscopy on some fragments to determine the chemistry of the glazes more precisely than we did with a handheld XRF. But also, we still need to carry on looking for tiles. There are some tile friezes represented by a single tile that we know can't fit anywhere else. And so the whole rest of that frieze is out there somewhere. And we know there are things missing. For instance, we have, as Lisa said, there's an almost complete frieze of a group of men with horses. And we have almost an entire frieze, and we have fragments of the second frieze, because there's usually two completely different friezes. But each one is missing this beautiful 4-tile portrait of a horse. So somewhere out there on the wall of some stately home or something like that are those 4 tiles times 4, because there are 4 of those horses out there, and we don't know what they are. And that's just some of the things which should be out there. And we just need to beat the bushes some more. Perhaps this video will bring some people forward and say, oh, I have one of those tiles, which would be absolutely wonderful. I think that's where I would like us to go to next.
That will be certainly wonderful. Thank you. And Dr. Golombek, how about from your perspective?
Well, of course, I am equally intent on rounding up the full lot, of these arches. As Dr. Mason said, each one of these arches has a twin out there, because we hypothesize that each set of stories ran along an arcade, along probably a garden courtyard, and its twin or its parallel ran along the other side. So, and they aren't all identical in terms of coloration, but they are in terms of the use of the same cartoon. At any rate, that's a lot of tiles to round up. So we'd like to get the full set. And then we, excuse me, 2 main questions that I have. One is, what building did they really come from? Now, we have suggested one of the palaces of Isfahan from the 17th century, from a refurbishing later in the century. But, maybe there is another one that's possible. So that's one very, very interesting question. The other one is, what is the sum of all these stories? What do they mean? Why were they selected to be put together? I mean, we have some are taken from famous works of Persian literature like Shahnameh and Nizami, Jami. Others are taken from local scenes of the city, from Isfahan, of entertainments and games or religious ceremonies. So we don't really know what this all means, and this would be certainly something that maybe other colleagues and scholars can contribute once they know what the full repertory is. So there's a long distance to go on this.
And I think that's one of the beauty of the research. There's always a lot that we discover, and then there's a lot to continue work on. So this is amazing. So thank you very much. Thank you to both of you, and also thank you to our visitors to join us today. And please visit our online collection to find some further information about these styles. Thank you very much again. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.